Hello, my friend. Welcome to the study. For this lovely afternoon in a quiet, peaceful spot, I've made some green tea for us to share. Look at that lovely, delicate color. Nice and refreshing. And gentle, giving off a beautiful green tea leafy aroma of spring. Today we're going to look at one of London's famous squares, a small one with a little bit of history and some of its most interesting inhabitants. Hanover Square, so named for the Hanoverian kings, the four Georges: George the First, George the Second, George the Third, George the Fourth, and William the Fourth, the fourth Hanoverian king. They ruled England during a time of great artistic, architectural, literary development, as well, of course, as economic and scientific advances. A time when London was growing in population. Education was becoming more prevalent, and the world becoming more accessible. All kinds of exciting things were happening, and many of these personages that participated in those, as well as some less palatable things, lived on Hanover Square. But in addition, Hanover Square was the place of the Queen's Concert House, home to some very famous concerts and lively performances. So join me in the study as we go back to 18th century London. The history of the London Square begins in 1631 with the great name of Inigo Jones. The Duke of Bedford had hired Inigo Jones to transform his property, the old convent garden which had formerly supplied vegetables to Westminster Abbey, into an elegant piazza with fashionable residences. This trend then began with what would become Covent Garden, although it was interrupted by the Commonwealth and Cromwell's government, and later the Great Fire of London and the Plague in 1666. But little by little, similar schemes took place. Red Lion, Golden, Soho, and Leicester Square were formed. And anticipating the rapid growth of London, Parliament passed in 1711 the commission for building 50 new churches. These would be funded by the coal tax. Although this target was never achieved, the many churches that proliferated in the early decades of the 18th century were designed by the greatest contemporary architects, including Nicholas Hawksmoor, James Gibbs, Thomas Archer, and John James. A Swiss visitor, César de Saussure, wrote an account of the London squares in 1725. London has many fine open spaces called squares, because they are of that shape. The centres of these squares are shut in by railings of painted wood and contain gardens with flowers, trees, and paths. Those of Soho, of Leicester Fields, of the Red Lion and the Golden Square are in this style. Those of Hanover and Cavendish are not yet finished, and belong to a newly built quarter. That of St. James is fine. It is surrounded with handsome houses belonging to wealthy noblemen. In the centre of this square is a fine fountain, surrounded by iron balustrades, with lanterns at equal distances. Going towards the city you see another big place, named by the French Common Jardin, and by the English Covent Garden. Every sort of flower, fruit, and garden produce is sold here. It is surrounded on two sides by fine arcades, which are most convenient for shelter in bad weather. John James designed St. George's Church, where the composer George Frederick Handel himself would attend. Having come over from Germany with the Elector, who would be George I of England, Handel himself would live in Brook Street when it was finished in 1719. Hanover Square, next to St. George's Church, was one of the first to be developed in 1717, followed by St. James, Grosvenor, Cavendish and Berkeley Squares. Each area was laid out as a complete unit. Elegant terraces of houses in the square itself, secondary streets with less expensive houses radiating away from it. Beyond these secondary streets were further sets of back streets where servants and traders lived, and each area included a marketplace and a graveyard attached to its church. The most gifted architects were employed by the landowners, incorporating styles such as Dutch, Italian, French, and Palladian. This rapid and impressive transformation of the city was written about by Daniel Defoe in 1724, when he wrote new squares and new streets rising up every day to such a prodigy of buildings that nothing in the world does or ever did equal it. For the beginnings of Hanover Square, we must go back to the previous century, the 17th century, and the last king of the Stuart dynasty, James II. Richard Lumley, 1st Earl of Scarborough, was brought up a Catholic and served under James II. But he converted to Protestantism in 1687 and played an important part in establishing William III on the throne alongside Mary. He was rewarded with titles and offices, and accession of George I, he celebrated this new dynasty from Hanover by naming the first of the second wave of London squares in its honour. The layout of Hanover Square was probably the work of Thomas Barlow, who acted for Lord Scarborough in negotiations concerning St. George's Church. He is known to have built some of the houses in the square and St. George Street. Barlow had previously done a good deal of work in Covent Garden and on the Berkeley estate in Mayfair, and was later employed in the design of Grosvenor Square. The other architect involved was the French Nicolas Dubois. He was probably a Huguenot refugee, and he designed numbers 8, 9, 19, 20, and 21 in the square. Today, only number 20 survives in anything like its original shape and form. Dubois also designed number 15 in St. George Street, and it used to be said that as a further compliment to the new king, the houses of St. George Street and some in the square were designed in a German style, but the exotic impression created was certainly French. Hanover Square itself is quite small, and most of the plots were large, so there were only 25 houses. Quite unconventional in that there was not a lot of room for carriages. Some of it was a little unpopular. In 1771, John Stuart wrote, "As to Hanover Square, I do not know what to make of it. It is neither open nor enclosed. Every convenience is railed out, and every nuisance railed in. Carriages have a narrow, ill-paved road to pass round in, and the middle has the air of a cow-yard where blackguards assemble in the winter to play at hustle-cap, up to the ankles in mud. This is the more to be regretted as the square in question is susceptible of improvement at a small expense. The buildings are neat and uniform. The street from Oxford Road falls with a gentle descent into the middle of the upper side, while right opposite George Street retires, converging to a point. The square did see some improvement over the next few years, and the first leases were granted in 1717. The first house was occupied in 1719, and the square was nearly complete by 1728. Soon afterwards, St. George's Parish Church was built to the south of the square. In 1759, James Abercrombie, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in North America during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, lived there in St. George Street. The church had an imposing portico, which was impaired by the narrowness of St. George Street. It would have done better to have a grand approach or possibly a sight on the square itself. Nevertheless, it became the capital's most fashionable venue for society weddings. Houses, properties, and buildings were merged or subdivided, resulting in subtle changes to the numbering scheme. While few of the 18th century houses remain largely intact today, most houses have been replaced in later periods. Now Hanover Square is occupied by offices, including the London office of Vogue. In the 2010s, the northwest corner of the square was removed and rebuilt as part of the Crossrail project. A new Bond Street entrance was made for the Elizabeth line, and commercial office space was made in a new building above the entrance. The square had seen many changes over 300 years. Let's have a look at some of the interesting personages who lived there from the 18th through the 19th centuries. In the mid-18th century, the square had become a glittering success. In its early years, Sir Francis Dashwood was the first resident, living at number 16 from 1719 until his death in 1724. Sir Theodore Jansen of the South Sea Bubble was the first tenant of number 20, followed by the Duke of Bolton and his mistress, Lavinia Fenton. The Earl of Coventry was the first at number 15. Other residents included the Earl of Pomfret and the Duke of Montrose. And the Dukes of Roxburgh at number 12 resided from 1721 to 1795. The Great Roxburgh Library afterwards moved to number 13, St. James Square, but it was founded at this mansion, which became Harewood House in 1795. Harewood House's stables faced Oxford Road, or what is now Oxford Street, and being the residence of Lord Harewood. The interior, we gather from a Mr. T. Raikes in his journal, is given an amusing account. He writes that the finest collection of old china in England will be found in the house of Lord Harewood in Hanover Square, a nobleman whose agricultural pursuits and simple habits would give little reason to suppose that he was possessed of such an expensive article of luxury and taste. Fagg the Chinaman, since the renewed rage in England for old valuables, has in vain offered Lord Harewood immense sums for this collection, but it was originally made by his elder brother, well known then as Beau Lascelles, who died unmarried in 1814, and is always preserved in the family as a souvenir of him. These brothers were always much attached to each other, but never was a greater contrast seen than in the refinement of the one and the simplicity of the other. Beau Lascelles was the essence of fashion of that day. He was a handsome man, rather inclined to be fat, which gave him a considerable resemblance to George, Prince of Wales, whom he evidently imitated in his dress and manner. He was very high-bred and amicable in society, and his taste in all that surrounded him was undeniable. His house, his carriages, horses, and servants, without any attempt at gaudy trappings, were the admiration of all the town, from the uniform neatness and beauty of their tenue. The ensemble of his equipage, when he went to court on a birthday, might really be compared to a highly finished toy. His house, though not large, was a museum of curiosities, selected with great taste and judgment at a time when he had few competitors, and had they all been preserved, they would now be of incalculable value. His life was luxurious but short, as he died at the age of 50. The house at the southwest corner, number 20, long the home of the Duke of Bolton, was let in 1748 to the poet Ambrose Phillips, of namby-pamby fame, who died there in 1749. By that time he was an Irish MP and legal functionary. Lord Rodney died in 1792 at number 10 at the south corner of Prince's Street, which was at least nominally the home of his son and successor. This was probably made necessary by the Admiral's chronic death. The second Viscount Palmerston lived at number 23, which he bought in 1790. He recorded, paid Lord Cadogan for his house in Hanover Square, fixtures and some furniture, £10,878, 7 shillings and sixpence. But he then employed the notoriously slow and expensive Henry Holland to make alterations, and the house was not ready for the family to occupy until 1796. Even then the chimneys smoked, threatening to spoil the new furniture. This was the childhood home of the third Viscount, the Prime Minister, but he was glad to get rid of it soon after succeeding, as it was large and costly to maintain. It included a sizable, private garden behind the houses in George Street. In 1808 he wrote from the Albany, "I'm happy to say I have got a house, and have let my own in Hanover Square to Lord Cowder, who takes it on." After the second Viscount Palmerston, who eventually went over to William Pitt's party from the Whigs, and this third Viscount, who got rid of the place, it was then the home of the Duchess of Brunswick, the sister of George III. In November 1810, Lord Glenbervie noted in his diary, "I went in the evening last night to meet Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, and Lady Glenbervie at the Duchess of Brunswick's, who had taken Lord Palmerston's house in Hanover Square for the season. The Duchess died there in 1813. The old number 15 was the home of the unfortunate Sir Godfrey Webster, who committed suicide there on 3rd of June, 1800. The house may then have included all or part of the adjoining number 1 Tenderton Street, if the account in the diary of his former wife, the famous Lady Holland, is accurate. She writes, "On Tuesday he went out at 9 o'clock and purchased at Eggs, a shop in the Haymarket on the corner of Coventry Street, a brace of pistols, and after various devices and stratagems to get his servants out of the way, he but too fatally succeeded, and at 4:30 shot himself in his front drawing-room in Tenderton Street." Prince Talleyrand lived at number 21 from 1830 to 1834 as a French ambassador, carrying on, at least in spirit, the great tradition established there by Lord Hillsborough in 1724. When Wellington told William IV that he would have to receive the Duchesse de Dinant, Talleyrand's niece, companion, and reputed mistress, as ambassadress, the king replied, "Oh, very well, I will tell the Queen, and you had better tell her too." The third Earl of Lucan, the Crimean general, and one of the central figures in the controversy over the charge of the Light Brigade, was another resident of number 20. Living in Hanover Square in 1792 was the gallant Admiral Lord Rodney. It was well known that his favourite daughter eloped to Gretna Green with Captain Chambers, a son of the eminent architect Sir William Chambers. At first he was inclined to be angry, but soon he relented and said, "Well, well, what is done cannot be undone, but it's odd that my own family is the only crew that I never could manage, and I only hope that Jessie will never mutiny under her new commander." And yet another house lived Sir William and Lady Fairfax and their daughter Mary Somerville, the famous mathematician and astronomer in 1816, who attended lectures at the Royal Institution. In addition to the many residents of Hanover Square, there were also many illustrious societies and clubs. In 1865, the Arts Club was established at number 17, instituted for the purpose of facilitating the social intercourse of those who are connected, either professionally or as amateurs, with art, literature, or science. Charles Dickens was a member of this club, as well as many of those from the Royal Academy, and many rising artists of the day, as well as literary celebrities. On the north side of the square at number 15, extending back into Oxford Street, is the Royal College of Chemistry. Founded in 1845 for the purpose of affording adequate opportunities for instruction in practical chemistry at a moderate expense, and for promoting the advancement of chemical science by means of a well-appointed laboratory and other appliances. The first stone of the laboratory, which has a handsome elevation on the south side of Oxford Street, was laid by the late Prince Consort in January 1846. Fees for the students are in proportion to the number of days each week that they attend. One of the less palatable and more vice-like things occurring in Hanover Square at this time was a Hellfire Club written about by Lady Mary Wortley Montague in 1724. She says, at number 19, they call themselves the Schemers, and meet regularly 3 times a week to consult on gallant schemes for the advancement of that branch of happiness which the vulgar call whoring. Viscount Hillsborough has turned his house, one of the handsomest in Hanover Square, into an edifice appropriated to this use. Of all of these residents, none could equal the fame and glamour of the Hanover Square Rooms, later the Queen's Concert Rooms, on the north corner of Hanover Street. Originally in the parish of St. Martin-in-the-Fields, in 1778 it was joined onto that of St. George's, and formed part of the premises in the occupation of Matthew Lord Dillon, the landlord being the Earl of Plymouth, who sold it to Lord Denman, who in turn resold it to Sir John Gallini, by whom the house and the original concert room were erected in the first half of the reign of George III. The architect was Richard Edwin, who also designed Stratford Place. It was in 1774 that Gallini, joining with Johann Christian Bach and Carl Friedrich Abel, converted the premises into an assembly room and gave the now famous concert series from 1785 to 1793, countering the attraction that had been growing to all the fashionable gatherings in Soho Square in the West End, where music went hand in glove with masked balls and all manner of frivolous dissipations. King George III himself was accustomed to frequently attend these concerts, together with Queen Charlotte, and it is said that His Majesty showed such an active interest in the performances that he had a room added to the side called the Queen's Tea Room. In this apartment, over the mantelpiece was fixed a large gilt looking-glass, which he presented to the rooms that they might keep forever. Many people attended these concerts, including the Prince Consort and the Duke of Wellington. King George took the warmest interest in these concerts, and occupied the royal box with his queen and family night after night, and would constantly write out the programs of the performances in his own hand. The rooms remained open for 100 years, and for most of that time this was London's leading concert venue. It was here that Haydn directed his London symphonies for the Solomon Concerts between 1791 and 1794, and Berlioz conducted his own music in 1848 and 1852. Change came to the square in the late 19th century. Between 1823 and 1912, the northwestern corner was haunted in summer by a discordant melody of sounds from the pupils of the Royal Academy of Music in Tenderton Street, practicing their various voices and instruments with the windows wide open. Another thing that brought change to the square was the building of the Oriental Club at number 16 in 1827 and 28, as well as the establishment of two hotels, the Hanover at number 3 and the Brunswick at number 10, both on the east side of the square. By 1843 there were only 9 private residents, including Lords Harewood, Portman, Downshire, and Lucan. In 1907, Beresford Chancellor wrote that no square in London has undergone such a transformation. Where used to dwell notable sailors, soldiers, statesmen, and people generally of light and leading, is now given over to the dressmaking art, to learned societies with portentous names, or to business establishments with the most uncompromising exteriors. Today, there are only 4 old houses remaining in the square. The rest is a medley of Victorian, Edwardian, and late 20th century vulgarity. The novelty is a cross-rail entrance to Bond Street Station at the corner of Tenterton Street, where the Oriental Club stood until the early 1960s. But in spite of all the changes, Hanover Square, with its small, shady public garden, retains a certain dignity. Chantrey's 1820s statue of Pitt still admires the famous view down St. George Street to the church, and on the north side, a rare 1897 cabman's shelter in green camouflage nestles against the railings. Thank you to all of the study's supporters, and a special thank you to the study's March patrons. Andreas, thank you. Thank you. Ben, thank you. Thank you. Bernie, thank you. Thank you. Joshua, thank you, thank you. Pirate Carrie, thank you, thank you. Romulus, thank you, thank you. Theorem, thank you, thank you. And Carman 1000, thank you, thank you. Until next time, be good to yourself, my friend. Be kind to others, and be extra